Pity breakers. Everyone's been through them, at least if they play the game, and some of them are good. You know, you have your good 5-star units. I can't really think of any because there's a lot of them. There are also a lot of bad ones that plagued the pool for who knows how long. The odds end up getting better over time as more and more units do end up getting removed from the pool as newer, more power creep versions that'll kick your butt continue to get released into the game. But even so, for long-time players and short-time players, or if you're brand new, I'm sure you probably got a unit that wasn't exactly on focus that you didn't necessarily want, but it couldn't always be a bad pity breaker. No. That is reserved for a select few amount of units. Nowadays, I would say it's better than how it started, but even back then, there were some 5-star units or even 4 and 5-star units, which that was a thing at the time, that you could get that just absolutely ruined your summoning rate. And really what I want to do is go over a brief history of all the worst pity breakers that you could have gotten while playing the game. There were and still are a lot of bad pity breakers that you could get in the game. And to keep it more simplified, I'm going to be selecting the standout units from each individual color based on how many times they changed up the pool. And what I mean by that is every time they change up the pool to add new units or remove older units or demote them or anything, there will be a new updated unit for the worst pity breaker. So for example, if we go all the way back to pool 1, I can tell you all the demote healers that pity broke you were not exactly the greatest. I initially wanted to put George, mainly because he doesn't really offer much in terms of fodder and he has a PRF, so you couldn't even inherit a Bow Plus. But I feel like a lot more people had a bitter experience when it came to demote healers as 5-stars than anything else. And as such, I wanted to put them in the colorless category. That's how we're really going to go about it. As for red, blue, and green, that is completely up in the air because there were a lot of 4 and 5-stars that you probably didn't want to get as a 5-star. And as such, it was a bit harder to decide which would be the worst pity breaker. It could have been easier just to choose the 5-stars, but it wouldn't be a pity breaker video if you didn't get pity broken by a 4 and 5-star. So out of all the reds and all the blues and all the greens that I could have chosen for representing the worst pity breaker at launch as in the pool wasn't tampered with whatsoever until a certain point, I chose Seliph, Matilda, and Titania Merrick. Titania Merrick, I couldn't really decide between the two. Titania, I felt, didn't really have as much value as Merrick, but at the same time, Merrick also kind of fell into that similar category of George syndrome, where he just didn't have anything in terms of notable inheritables, and he was definitely a lot more standout-ish comparatively to the healers in terms of pity breaks, even though he wasn't exactly the worst unit. Titania at the very least had guard, but I wouldn't say that was worth getting pity broken over. Emerald Axe and everything else that she came with, it wasn't exactly something that was a, well, I'm glad I got that over some other 4-star unit, which is why I put her here. And as for Seliph and Matilda, it kind of follows a similar thing. Seliph isn't exactly known for his fodder, as with a lot of the older units, to be fair, but at the very least, you could still use them for HP plus 5 if you wanted to use them in stuff like Ponza Loki, but that wasn't a thing back then. And even then, I don't think HP plus 5 was the most desirable thing at the time. And Matilda doesn't really offer anything. She had a Rider's Bane, but Cavalry effectiveness has and will always remain a meme because Cavalry are not really known for their bulk. And I would argue this was probably the hardest decision when it came to just choosing the worst pity breakers at the time. But a bit over a year later, in version 2.4, they decided to demote most of the 4 and 5-star units, which is great because now we have even worse pity breakers, such as Sanaki and Olwen. Olwen in particular was probably the worst of the bunch, mainly because Reinhardt was a 3 and 4-star unit who was leagues better than her simply because he had an attack stat, and because of Dire Thunder's low might, Olwen really wasn't going to be doing a lot of damage in general, even if you were to max invest in her. She's doing a lot better nowadays, but back then she was more so known as the 0x2 unit, or even in some cases 0x4. It was kind of sad, and I'm honestly surprised they kept her as the 5-star, but you know what? It worked out for a lot of players for a long while. And as for Sanaki, I mean, Triangle Adept, Symboline, Harsh Command, there's only so much that can be said here. And as for your green and colorless units at the time, we have Female Kana and Jafar. Female Kana, I think, was going to be one of the more questionable ones, mainly because she was relatively new at the time. She scored well enough because of her BST. She has Water Breath and Fierce Stance. I think it's definitely a lot harder to judge it nowadays, especially since we have access to so many things in the 3 and 4-star pool comparatively to way back then. And this was a 5-star skill. Nowadays, you could just get Fierce Stance off anything, or by anything, really just any 3 and 4-star that has it. And speaking of which, Jafar, who has nothing but Life and Death 3, the same skill that Soth came with as a demote, probably a few months prior to the demote change. Yeah, that wasn't really great for him. Jafar, at the very least, and then in the following year, they updated it again. Say, wait, updated it? Anyway, they updated the pool once again, but no longer could you get a lot of the 5 stars from Gen 1, which was pretty great. But now you still have to deal with other stuff, such as Siegbert and Shiro and Mordecai. Siegbert for a while was the only one that had attack tactic, which wasn't even bad whatsoever since you could grant a lot of allies 6 attack for nothing, which was pretty good. But then they demoted Legalt and he came with it, and it became way easier to grab it, which kind of sucked because that was the only thing he really had to offer. He didn't have an inheritable sword, didn't really have anything else worthwhile to keep him as a 5-star. Same thing with Shiro, although defense tactic was a lot more rare. He really wasn't exactly something you wanted to get regardless. At least to me, I didn't find it to be the most desirable thing you had to have, especially back then. Tactics are still pretty good, but I don't think it was something that you had to have in order to just stand out, especially defense tactic, which is why I put him on here. Although if there was just only one candidate, it would just go to Mordecai because Mordecai doesn't have anything to offer and he was able to ruin your pity for no discernible reason other than the fact that he was a 4 and 5-star unit. Attack defense link was still decent enough, and it's okay-ish. Okay, maybe. It's something. And because beasts are beasts, you couldn't have any sort of inheritable weapon that you could give to anybody else. Every beast has a PRF, and what they come with is what they're stuck with. And since the book 2 5-stars were still readily available to summon, kind of still remains as one of the less appealing 5-stars that you could get, especially by this point. And Python could also pity break you, but at the very least, he has an inheritable bow that people could have wanted, and Blue Tonebreaker if you wanted that for some reason, because it was only stuck on female Robin at the time, so that's cool. And as for the colorless units, I found that Leanne, Brady, and Mercedes were probably one of the worst ones that could pity break you. By this point, there weren't as many 5-star colorless units, which was nice on one hand, but it also meant you could still get pity broken by a demote healer, which, you know, demote healers, woo, we all love them, don't we? Especially the 4 and 5-star ones that could absolutely shred your pity. Leanne herself isn't even a bad unit, to be quite honest. She's a 3-move dancer, which is really, really good. I don't think anybody could disagree with that. I think the problem is that we just had one readily available in the 3 and 4-star pool. And while a one-off copy can still be pretty good, after that point, she doesn't really offer anything, and dancers don't really benefit from merges all too much. There are some scenarios where you could just stack HP and then run HP-based skills, you know, sudden panic, infantry pulse, all that stuff. But Leanne really couldn't do that. Her stat line wasn't really that great. She didn't really offer anything besides the dance, which is still fine. But as a pity break after the initial copy was not good at all. Eventually, these 3 and 4-star demotes would get removed from the 4 and 5-star pool, which was great. And it still left you with stuff like Siegbert and Shiro and all that, which was fine. But there was one unit they just didn't touch for a while because she fell out of the range where they would usually remove these 3 and 4-star units from the 4 and 5-star pool. And that was Altena. She was the only 4 and 5-star unit that could pity break you for a long time. They would remove it 10 months later, but I'm getting a bit of ahead of myself. By that point, we still had stuff like Ivol and Fiora who weren't really great on their own either. At least they had inheritable weapons, but I wouldn't say getting pity broken by any of them were appealing whatsoever, especially since we had pretty decent inheritables, especially the lances at the time. The swords was debatable, but I don't think Guard Sword was nearly appealing enough to be pity broken by it and be very happy about it. You also had Ranulf, and Leanne was still there because she was a Book 3 unit, so she just kind of sticks around for a while. She's, again, not a bad unit, but having more than one is a bit excessive at that point. But shoutouts to Ranulf for taking up female Kana's spot as one of the worst pity breakers you could get at the time. Rally Plus was still nice to have in and of itself because it helped you score in stuff like Arena, but if you didn't care for Arena, then it really didn't mean anything whatsoever, and it wasn't the only unit that could give you Rally Plus, which is why I did want to put him on here. Chill Attack was readily available, and Ward Beast is extremely niche. So yeah, Ranulf gets to join the group of worst pity breakers in the game into the latter half of 2020, I think around the August area. Yeah, it was something. So for anyone who was there at the time that got him, unless you really liked him, I feel really sorry for you. I do like him though, he's pretty cool. And really, after removing Altena in the following year, around February of 2021, the amount of pity breakers that were considered the worst really stagnated. It was pretty much just whatever was already bad at the time until they got removed. So it was still stuff like Fiora, Ival, Ranoff, all those for the most part, until they would remove units dating back from Quan to Keaton's banner. So that did remove Leanne from the 5-star summoning pool to pity break you. Randolph was still there because he was only a couple versions after Keaton, so you could still get pity broken by him. On the other hand though, you still had stuff like Fallen Tiki. This one was a bit harder to choose because at the time there weren't really that many bad colorless 5-stars. In fact, I would say most of them weren't even bad whatsoever. Really, it just kind of boiled down to who is the least good, and in my opinion, it really just fell down to Fallen Tiki. She had Solitary Dream, and she was in armor, so she scored really, really well. Again, that's only if you care about Arena. The fodder was okay-ish, and if you could get her to set up pretty well, then you were in business, but there really wasn't much else to it. Colorless weren't exactly in the worst spot, to be honest, especially with all the 3 and 4 stars removed from the 4 and 5-star pool. It felt more obligatory than anything else. You know, at least until Idune's banner all the way up to CYL3 was removed, and then we were left with stuff like Annette and Silk. Silk, again, I don't think was the worst of the bunch, especially since Melancholy was still pretty useful, but at the same time, it was all she had, and there were only so many times you could need a copy of Melancholy, which is why I think she's probably going to take the spot as the worst colorless pity breaker, at least up to version 6.2. There were still plenty of mediocre 5-stars that you could get, but I feel like this was the one that stood out the most. And as for Annette, she didn't really offer much outside of her supportive capabilities, which, to be fair, is perfectly fine, but I found that this just falls in line with another Leanne situation where once you have the one copy, everything else that comes after doesn't really add much value, which is why I added Annette here. And thankfully, after version 6.8, they decided to remove Ival and Fiora from the 5-star pool, which was great, because now we're stuck with Naimi and Melody, who are currently pity breakers. I don't think Naimi is awful. I'm coping. I'm really coping. I think I have a +5 Naimi. It's crazy. She really offers the most nothing kit that you could probably grab. Speed Res Bond and Joint Drive Res are extremely niche. She doesn't really have a good inheritable bow, and her PRF isn't exactly the best anyway. She hits hard, I guess, but that's all she could really accomplish, and, you know, a lot of units hit hard nowadays, so it's not really something that is entirely impressive. And as for Melody, she's basically just the no PRF 5-star that you may not have necessarily wanted, especially since her fodder is relatively outdated. Attack Defense Solo could still work in some scenarios if you want to give it to a bulky cav, but otherwise, Wyvern Flight and Instant Lance aren't exactly the greatest, and to be quite honest, even with Attack Defense Solo being there, you can still run stuff like Catch, and it generally does better because it grants additional attack and defense. But in my humble and correct opinion, not correct by the way, I just gotta clarify that, the worst pity breaker that you can get in the game currently comes from the colorless pool because of Nime, who has no inheritable weapon that anybody wants, no inheritable A that anybody wants, and no inheritable C that anybody wants. Oh, maybe the C, maybe. The C is a maybe, but the Solo 4 and the Vulture Tome that can only be equipped by colorless units, aka the ones that always have PRFs except for Nime for some reason, I don't think anybody ever wants this, and really she just kind of exists to merge, to be honest. I don't think there's ever a reason you would want to kill her off as opposed to just using her, and even then her viability is completely shot because she's stuck with one tome that isn't exactly the greatest anyway. So congratulations Nime, I'm very sorry, but wow, they did you dirty. And before closing this off, we have to talk about the one final pool chain, aka the ones that started all the way back from Annette's banner to CYL4. And you guessed it, nothing really changes, except Annette, who I now have replaced for Astrid. And this one might be a bit controversial because Astrid's a pretty decent support unit for the most part, but I still think it follows a similar suit to Annette and Leanne where you get the one, and after the one, there's really nothing else to do with it outside of merging or any sort of specific niche setup stuff. It's not exactly the greatest, but you know, if you do end up getting a single Astrid, I think she will do relatively well, just not in combat. But as a support, I think it's okay. And when it comes to the history of bad PD breakers and heroes, that's pretty much going to be it. I know this one is a lot more opinionated because some people see some value in one thing over the other, but I thought it was an interesting topic and I wanted to talk about it. And if you disagree with me, I hope all your colorless units are Nimes.